Hey, so it's been a little while. I just did recently a video that was definitely very political and betrayed maybe that I'm a conservative, which is true, if that wasn't clear from my previous videos. I also was a conservative before I was a Christian, and I can't help but have some of these thoughts, and they were, some of these thoughts I had as a result of a conversation I had with a close friend. I won't share his name. That I think can be kind of illuminating. So hopefully, this video can be pretty helpful to meditate on the question of, do Christians have to be conservative? And why they kind of do. They don't, but they kind of do. And I'm going to maybe elaborate on some of my thoughts on this in a minute. So I had a conversation recently with someone I really, good friend. I believe he's an Episcopalian. I am not. I'm in the ACNA. And he identifies himself as Orthodox, like doctrinally Orthodox. And as much as I like the guy, I think he's a smart dude, and I think he, surely saved, justified by his faith, and he's truly faithful. I kind of said, no, I think you're heterodox. And he would say, no, look at all these things that I believe. I believe in the Trinity. I affirm all of the creeds and all that stuff. How am I heterodox? And when I brought up issues like women's ordination or gay marriage, and how he disagreed with me on those things and thought they were acceptable, and even thought it was acceptable for his church to have fellow congregants who don't believe in God, although he adamantly believed that those were a serious minority. Whether or not they are, some other people disagreed with him on that issue, but in his personal experience, all of the churches he went to were in formation Orthodox. They believed in God, they believed in the Trinity, they believed Jesus literally died and resurrected. Why are these other things, I feel like he might say, are tertiary, like women's ordination and gay marriage, and you might even acknowledge that there are some dioceses in the ACNA which do ordain women, and I have nothing against them. I'm in communion with them, even if my diocese doesn't ordain women. I'm still recognizing those other dioceses. If I think this is so strong, why would I still be in the ACNA? That's a conversation for another time. But in theory, what is the Orthodox opinion on women's ordination? And you might say, there is none. There's no creed. There's no Bible verse that says thou shalt not ordain women. Obviously, some people might say it's a very strong entailment from the language that Paul uses about he doesn't permit women to teach to men on issues of faith. There's some questions around Junia. But what I think you have to say at a certain point is, well, what has the church believed for the majority of the history of the church? It's in theory possible that for a couple years, until we started getting, for like a couple decades, right? Junia is the example I was given. That maybe for a decade or two there were some female priests. Is the argument based off of silence, in my opinion, that we don't have any evidence that they didn't ordain women to the priesthood, even though all of the early fathers are men and all of this stuff. Who knows? Maybe we lost a lot of sources of female priests. Then you have to say, all right, so on this issue, the church changed its mind and then stridently, without any observable defectors, observed this belief from the time of Jesus until like the 1960s. And then you start to say, well, why did they do that? And the conversation I had with my good friend, he's basically arguing that it's because they were sexist. Most people, for most of the history of Western civilization, Eastern civilization, he was not holding back on other cultures which are sexist. He doesn't specifically say it's just Christianity, but basically we overcame our sexism. I think in his opinion, probably because of Christianity, we overcame sexism eventually. And so now that we've overcome these sexist distinctions, we should abolish them in the church. And, if that's his belief, that's his belief. I think that's heterodox. I think what, you might have to say, and I think he's also for gay marriage, even though we didn't really talk about it. But you have to start to wonder, was the church in disagreement on all of these things that we're now introducing because the church neglected Christian principles, or because you're now neglecting Christian principles, and that's why there's a disagreement there. And it's hard to say for sure. I mean, I'm not omnipotent. I don't know. I'm not, the things that this video is not inspired by God, but it might be something like, for instance, people will say, well, you think slavery is wrong. Well, Christians permitted slavery since the time of Jesus until the 19th century. But in my opinion, these are a very different issue because, I oppose slavery on a natural law perspective. I don't think the Bible literally outlaws and forbids slavery. I do think it implies slavery is bad. And I can evidence the fact that I think the Bible implies slavery is bad by quoting passages, by citing sources. The Bible seeks to regulate slavery, which intends that there's some really bad consequences of slavery. I also think if you look throughout the history of the church, you constantly get people saying slavery is bad. Gregory of Nazianzus is a perfect example. He's a very old church father, and he tried to abolish slavery on moral grounds. When slavery was beginning to be reinstitutionalized in the Spanish Empire by Christopher Columbus's expeditions to the New World, at the very inception of New World slavery, there was a Catholic priest named Bartolome de las Casas who said, slavery is bad, we should not do this. This is going to harm the souls of the people doing it, and this is going to harm the souls of the people we seek to evangelize by making us look like horrible people. And it seems like there's always been that position, some point in church history, that slavery is bad. Was it held by the entirety of the church? No. Obviously, there were some people who defended slavery, who were also claimed to be Christians. However, if I really want to claim that this position is orthodox, I think you have to be able to find it in church history. And that's just my opinion, but I think this is why I'm gonna make the argument that is crucial to actually evangelizing people. Because once you start to say that the church was not good, or not the beacon of progress that is actually progress in the world, then it starts to be like, well, why should I be Christian in the first place? If you guys could have messed up for thousands of years on this one issue that you now even admit was a mistake, it doesn't really seem like this church thing is actually very good for the world. And I think people struggle with that, but here's what I might point to if you had to doubt me on that opinion. Lots of Christian apologists I've noticed, these are just some examples, actually, and myself included basically, didn't become Christians because, needless to say, liberal Christianity is not very good at evangelizing people, but even the people that did become Christians, most of the time, were at some point left-wingers. The people I'm citing here are Redeemed Zoomer, who I really like, Swansona, who I also really like, and Trent Horn, who I also really like. There are people who had political opinions that became more conservative. Once they had their conservative opinions, Trent Horn is a good example. He started participating in pro-life activity before he was a Christian because he was convicted that it was immoral. And then he met Christians at pro-life stuff. And what it becomes obvious in that kind of sense is, oh, there's something moral, and these Christians, they're fighting for that moral thing, and they've always been fighting for it. This is what Christianity is. It's this fight for morality. Swansona brings up this example, and Redeemed Zoomer kind of have a similar story where they were originally Christians and left-wingers. They kind of tried to make it work and believe both positions, and they struggled over the abortion issue. But then eventually, they both agreed over time, actually, my left-wing opinions are irreconcilable with Christian beliefs. And they stopped being left-wingers. So it's not like there weren't people who had these opinions and thought of them as totally reconcilable. It seems like there's lots of people who end up wanting to reconcile these two opinions and failing. Trent Horn actually has a good video about why people leave the Catholic Church, and a large majority of the people that are actively leaving the Catholic Church today are not leaving it to become Protestants, guys, unfortunately. Right? They're leaving it because they received this moral wisdom from society that things like gay marriage are okay, divorce is okay, and they don't agree with the doctrines of the Catholic Church. That's what they put on these surveys when they say, I'm leaving the Catholic Church. Why are you leaving? I'm leaving because I disagree with the moral teachings of the Catholic Church. And, for Protestants who might say, yeah, that's because Catholics are bad. It's not the stuff that we disagree with them on that they're leaving for. It's not like they're saying, this transubstantiation thing seems ridiculous. Apparently, like 70% of Catholics don't even know about the doctrine of transubstantiation. But it's something like, or they're like, the Pope being an infallible magisterium doesn't really seem biblical. Like, that's not why they're leaving, and they don't think it's a contradiction. That they're having a trouble because their moral worldview is starting to make them think Christianity is evil, or Catholicism is promoting something evil to them, and that's why they leave. And for the same reverse happens is once they start to see Christianity as promoting something good, as promoting something positive in the world, they become Christians, because then it starts to seem like, oh, this is doing something good. I think a lot of people in the Jordan Peterson era of evangelism, which is such a strange way to put it, but I'm a part of that generation. I think lots of people are. They realize now, in a period where we're losing Christianity, all of the things Christianity was claiming to defend in the last century, they're like, oh wait, I actually wish we still had those things. I still wish we had a very successful marriage rate. I wish the divorce rate wasn't above 50%. I wish that when I went out into the dating marketplace, I think this is a very popular example for lots of young men. I wish when I went into the dating marketplace, I found women who wanted the same kind of relationship that I do. And they don't want that relationship because they're Christians yet. They just want that kind of relationship because it's something they want to protect somebody. They want to be the provider. They want that traditional male role before they are being inspired by Christianity to want that thing in the first place. And once they realize that Christianity was doing a lot of work in trying to preserve these social norms, in defending fault divorce, basically, right, the opposite of no fault divorce, and attacking no fault divorce, in trying to defend the sanctity of marriage between one man and one woman, trying to defend gender roles, trying to defend all these things, then they're suddenly attracted to Christianity. And so maybe first, before they became Christians, they started to think something positive about what Christianity was teaching. And it wasn't because Christianity just started teaching what they already believed. A good example I like to give of the kind of link between Christianity and conservatism is Tolkien. And I think it's one of the reasons that the more modern takes on Tolkien are just kind of flopping. Like, it's just kind of disgusting. Is because if you actually read anything Tolkien ever wrote about politics, or you read just Lord of the Rings or the Silmarillion, there's this general feeling, to summarize it maybe too much, that things generally get worse. There's like this halcyon golden age of in the past where there's elves and they're beautiful and their society is kind of elite and elegant, and then it kind of falls away. And by the time of Lord of the Rings, the elves are leaving Middle-earth, and there's something sad about just losing that beauty as time goes on, as the age of decay comes near. The age of men is kind of this phenomenon. I mean, you get this thing where in the past these battles with good and evil were much more cataclysmic because evil was much stronger, and or evil was much more violent and good was much more. There were higher stakes, I guess you could say, and that compare the wars with Morgoth in the earlier part of the Silmarillion, just to totally nerd out. But if you compare the wars with Morgoth to the wars with Sauron, there's a little bit lower stakes and a lot darker story than the one we get in Lord of the Rings, which is a dark story already. But yeah, you get this sense that when Aragorn restores the House of Gondor, that's good, because there's this kind of returning to a previous era that was good. And in Tolkien, who's a Christian, there's lots of allegory. I mean, he wouldn't like that word allegory, but there's lots of things that point to Christianity in the Lord of the Rings stories. But there's no Jesus Christ. No one says Deus Vult. There's no institutional Christianity in Arda or Middle-earth, right? But there is conservatism. There is all these messages of the past being good, monarchy being something divinely inspired. I always think of this scene of Gandalf, who's kind of an angel, kind of a priest, crowning Aragorn as very biblical, right? That's what the priests in the Old Testament do for kings, right? Pagan societies, which a lot of Lord of the Rings is based off of, don't have this kind of sense of divine appointment of kings that is Christian in some sense. I could talk about this forever, and maybe I will sometime, but basically, Tolkien kind of has this conservative streak. If you read C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity, he spends a lot of time defending, even in the 40s, Christian moral standards about modesty and all that kind of stuff. And it would come off to a modern person as conservative. There's a lot of people who lambast C.S. Lewis from the more progressive evangelical side for all of his comments about, or all of his insistence in lots of his short stories. Men and women are very different. Women are one way, men are the other. There's a bit about how this, I can't remember the story, but Gavin Ortlund summarizes. I actually haven't read it, but there's a story where a woman submits to God, finally, after realizing that the only reason she didn't want to submit to men in her society was because she wanted to be totally independent and have to submit to nobody. And that in learning that she has to submit to God and men, right, she kind of ascends, and that's kind of her moral arc. And some people might say that's problematic. That's kind of this weird, women should submit, right? Which, it seems pretty biblical in some sense, but there's lots of more context to it. But anyway, that's pretty conservative. That's pretty socially conservative. And you might say, what is this doing in my Christian story? Another example I always like to give with some people that I get this question a lot in real life with people that I'm having conversations with, but the idea that lots of Christian symbols, Christian things, especially stuff that I affirm basically as a more magisterial Christian, like Easter, look, this stuff is inherited from pagans. And, with Easter, you can always go to the point that, actually the original term is Pascha, which comes from Passover, and it doesn't have anything to do with Eostra, which is or Ishtar or something like that, because Ishtar is a Mesopotamian god, and Easter is just the English word for it. Eostra may have been a Germanic or Celtic nature deity, but you get this every Easter, right? The idea that there's all this pagan stuff that we adopted and that Christianity is kind of a lie. But what we have to kind of be able to say to these, which is what the early Christians were saying, is when they arrived in the British Isles and they brought this tradition of Pascha and they were explaining it to pagans, right? And the pagans would be like, this kind of sounds like rebirth motif. This kind of sounds like someone dies and sacrifices this natural cycle. We have a goddess that's of fertility, birth, whatever, and we celebrate it around the same time as you guys. And what I think some Protestants and some atheists would have expected a genuine Christian to do would be to say, those things are stupid. Don't do those at all. Only our thing is true, and we have to throw that away. And any association between Easter and Eostra has to be Pascha, and Easter has to be destroyed, because otherwise you will contaminate it with pagan ideas. But instead, it's something like these Christians were saying when they arrived there, hey, yeah, these themes and motifs, the things you already found beautiful, are present in Christianity. The things that the revelation that your society received through tradition is present in Christianity, and Christianity is the fulfillment, the final revelation of that, right? Of those things you already know to be true, right? Christianity is when Jesus arrives and he says, I have come not to destroy the law, but to fulfill it. I'm coming to make a full version of the traditions you already accept, right? Lots of people will point this out, that the word, the logos, which is often time used for Jesus because of John 1:1, where Christ is the Word, and the Word comes from Greek philosophy. The idea that there's this ultimate logos. This is a Plato. Here, Plato dealt with it a lot, and Platonic ideals ended up bleeding a lot into Christianity. And lots of more modern kind of restorationist mind Protestants want to get rid of everything to do with Greek philosophy and the tradition of Christianity. But if they do that, then in my opinion, they'd have to get rid of the Book of John, because the Book of John does reference a lot of Greek philosophy. And Paul does this a lot of the time in his epistles. He's basically saying, look, he goes to Athens, literally, this like hub of Greek philosophy, and he says, your philosophical traditions betray the truths underneath that we already know. And he's not saying, I'll get to this in a second, I guess, but this is another example, are saints that are all over the place that people say, is that saint real? Right? This is Saint Bridget, because that might be just a reference to Bridget, an Irish Celtic goddess, right? And so there's something of like the integration of all of this pagan stuff into Christianity, and isn't that not authentic? Isn't that wrong? And there are lots of people who will point out all of the doctrines that they're addressing. I was bringing this up earlier with Pasqua, but all of the doctrines that these things adapt to, all of the motifs, all the lessons, all of the ideas are actually Christian inherently. And what the expectation we would have in a world where God is real and all of these truths are factual is that people outside of the story of the Judeo liberation and the story of Christ would have discovered some of these facts about the world. And what you have to say is you have to say, look, these traditions betray the natural revelation of Jesus Christ. And that's, I think, what these evangelists were doing. And that's what we kind of have to be able to do today. And I think that's where this link comes in. The example I'll sometimes give about why tradition is important and is the idea that is Chesterton's fence, I think, is a good example. Is if someone, you may have heard this before, if somebody walks into the woods and finds a fence in the middle of the woods, I think this is how it goes. Someone finds a fence in the middle of the woods and says, they look around and they don't know why the fence is here. They should only be able to take down the fence that they don't have an explanation for once they find the explanation and say, oh yeah, that they don't need that. Right? Because maybe there's fencing something dangerous into the forest, right? You don't know, so you don't have the authority to take down the fence. And the same thing happens with traditions a lot. You'll ask people who hate X tradition or X fact or whatever, they don't know why that tradition was there in the first place. And so unless you can explain that tradition and say, here's why it no longer applies, you can't really get rid of it. And because what traditions are technology. They're the way we deal with the reality of the world. And we need those things to do that. And I think if you accept that premise, that we need traditions, it becomes pretty obvious. I mean, I basically appeal to this in half my videos, but it becomes pretty obvious that Christianity is one of the best contenders for one of the best and most prolific traditions out there. And any religion might be better than none if you believe traditions are good, because it doesn't seem like there's that much traditional atheism, right? There's no societies who founded their entire social structure on atheism. And have this long, complicated philosophy of it. I mean, people will even point to Eastern religions, like in China, Confucianism, which doesn't literally say there is a god or there are spirits, is always coupled in Chinese society with the spirit veneration, and there is a spiritual world there that gives full life to the philosophies of Confucianism. And if you look at the link between religion and conservatism, it is there. This is just a very minimal Pew statistic, but if you just look at people who say their belief in God is absolutely certain, they're more likely to be Republican. If you look at people who don't believe in God, they're more likely to be Democrats. If they go to church once a week, they're more likely to be Republican. If they go to church seldom or never, they're more likely to be a Democrat. A lot of this, the top graph is probably skewed by people who are certain that they're spiritualists, but that doesn't really have a tradition attached to it, right? I believe in a relationship with God, but not religion. That's what a lot of people will say. Those people are more likely to be Democrats, and they're less likely to accept Christian tenets, right? And so when you start to say, do you have to be conservative to be a Christian? Or the other way around, right? Once you become a Christian, do you become conservative? I think the relationship is, if you have a value in tradition, if you have a value in Western civilization, right, Christianity is a core part of that. So to get back to the conversation I had with my friend before about what is Orthodox and why is it important to say that women's ordination is unorthodox or heterodox? Why is it important to stick the line on marriage between one man and one woman? These things aren't defined by ecumenical creeds. I mean, even if you were Catholic, right? I've heard this before, actually, from some liberal Catholics. There's no Vatican statement, or there's no nothing that meets the magisterial ex cathedra statement saying that we won't ordain women. Popes have said a lot of stuff about that, but popes have said a lot of stuff about the death penalty, and you can see there's some kind of disagreement there. I won't get into that right now, but basically you say, okay, it's not orthodox. These parts of Christianity are tertiary, and they're not a part of the Orthodox core. And just because they weren't practiced by Christians for thousands of years doesn't mean anything. And you have to say no, because what you're billing, when you're billing Christianity, is Western civilization. Why? Because Western civilization, you have to be able to affirm, was built by Christianity, and that the work of Christ on earth played itself out in Western civilization, right? And that is good, and that those things are good. So if you believe that Western civilization is the root of all evil, you cannot become Christian, right? Think about all of the debates around the Crusades as an example I'll always give. I think this started with Protestants, to be honest, but Protestants who will look back at Catholic history and they'll try to find all the horrible stuff popes and priests did, and you can find it. But what that ends up doing is it ends up saying, look, the guys who claim to be defending Christ, okay, they are horrible people. And they didn't do anything good. And nothing good came out of Christianity. But be a Christian. And you're just like, what? Why would I do that? If the people then that were claiming to be the bearers of Christ's message were capable of such evil that even you recognize, why would I trust you who claims to bear Christ's message? It kind of seems silly. When talking to a secular friend of mine, I explained that I was Anglican, not Episcopalian, and he's left-winger. He said, well, at least you guys claim to believe what the book says in reference to Episcopalians. He's an atheist. He's liberal. He doesn't admire Episcopalians for caving to the LGBT ideas. Doesn't admire them for beginning women's ordination. He sees them as capitulating and being dishonest. There's no perception of these churches as having any claim to being authentically Christian, because I think as conservatives can agree and see, and maybe more cynical secular atheists can see, Western civilization was built by Christianity. And so you defend Western civilization if you're in a Western country, and you defend Christianity, or you defend neither to a certain extent, right? Christianity was a revolution. I mean, think about Tom Holland's book Dominion. Like, we remade civilization based on Christian principles. So if women's ordination was a part of the Christian principles at the beginning, you would have thought it would have come up. Every other issue, in Christianity, there were people arguing about it. Icons, there were people arguing about it. The Trinity, there were people arguing about it. Church polity, eventually people started arguing about it. I think this is a good argument. By the way, like, it's hard to be Episcopalian and say that, the bishops have more explicit support in the Bible than complementarian gender roles. The idea that men and women complement each other but are equal in dignity but not equal in abilities, right? It seems like the Bible is saying a lot about men and women being equal in dignity and not equal in ability. Women, there's lots of rules for just women, and there's lots of rules just for men, and there's lots of treatments of men and women as different categories, and there's lots of punishment for men who dress up as women, and women who dress up as men, or men who have sexual relations with other men. Bible's full of that stuff, and if you can throw that stuff out, then it doesn't really seem like you're being an authentic bearer of this message to anybody outside of Christianity. It seems like you're picking and choosing. And I know people will say, evangelicals pick and choose. The Catholic Church picks and chooses. Every Christian picks and chooses stuff from the Bible. And it's like, you might think that. Obviously, if someone disagrees with you on any doctrine, you'll just think that they're picking and choosing because they don't agree with you. But there's something to the difference between a conservative Presbyterian and a conservative Lutheran arguing about the real presence, where both of them can reasonably say, our different views are found in Scripture, and that's where I think you're authentically getting it from. But nobody believes that liberal Christians are getting these authentic doctrines just from Scripture, inside or outside the church. And I know that's harsh, and I have lots of friends who are liberal Christians, and I don't want to make it sound like I am upset with you. I don't think that, and I think it's a heterodox opinion, but it doesn't mean you're going to hell. As an individual statement about your justification, Christ redeems you, not me, not my opinion. So you're in luck there. But I do think that we're obliged to do kingdom work. Liberal Christians are usually the best at admitting this. We're supposed to be doing work on earth here for Christ's kingdom. And if the Christians that came before you were doing a horrible job at that, you don't seem very connected to the communion of saints that came before you. And I think it's hard to evangelize from that position. It's hard to evangelize once you have to admit that the church was sexist for 2,000 years in a way that's irreconcilable with our modern church's take on sexual and gender relationships. I think that's the kind of problem you've got here. Maybe I'm wrong. If you disagree, leave a comment. People always do when they disagree. I don't know if a lot of people that agree tend to leave comments. If you like the video, please like and even comment. It definitely helps when the people that like the videos comment. I'll keep doing them anyway, though, even for the people that hate these videos. Thank you. God bless.